I'm not gonna be a $70 million business like a Morning Brew is, but I think I can definitely be competitive within kind of my unit economics in Mexico.
Right. Please don't sell yourself short. Your growth numbers are crazy, so they are impressive in its own right. Bienvenido de nuevo. Welcome back to the Let's Stack podcast. As you can see, we have clearly a unique Mexican flavor to the podcast today. That's because I have Fernando Caralt, who is the founder and operator of one of the largest newsletters in the Mexico tech scene called Espresso Matutino, which by the way means morning espresso in Spanish. Espresso Matutino was started because Fernando wanted to bring a unique morning brew experience but with nuances to the Mexico tech market. He grew it to 140,000 subscribers, but I believe he's just getting warmed up because he's not stopping at that. So we're going to get Fernando to spill the beans on today's episode in the Let Us Stack podcast. Fernando, welcome to the Let Us Stack podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Ranga. That was great Spanish too, the name and the welcome back. So yeah, I appreciate you trying there. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And that's as much Spanish as I can muster. So I will leave you at that. I will not bore you with anything else. Yeah. But thank you
Sounds
for
good.
being kind with my pronunciation. Yeah. Awesome. But Fernando, welcome. And I know that you have a massive newsletter that you're operating today with a very small, tight knit crew. We are going to talk about all the details.
Hmm.
But I wanted to get started with I understand that you started in tech but you pivoted to newsletters. Somewhere in between, I guess there is a story that's not talked about enough. So, would you mind talking about why you started Espresso?
Yeah. I guess looking backwards, the dots connect a little more gracefully than when it was happening at the time. But yeah, my background is in engineering. So to give you context, I'm actually not even from Mexico. I'm from Spain. Uh,
Awesome.
so I moved to the U.S. when I was like 13 or so. But I studied mechanical engineering, undergrad and master's. So I got 2 degrees that I don't use for anything right now. Uh,
That makes
and
two of us actually.
yeah.
Yeah.
There's plenty I've been finding out over time. Yeah. But I worked in R&D for a while in a company kind of deep in tech, and then I was just a little unfulfilled during COVID, and I started trying out as one does in these like online businesses. I started kind of the classic gateway drug to entrepreneurship, which is drop shipping. And then from there, over the years, I kind of tried different businesses. I discovered kind of the power of what it means to have an audience versus having a product first. The business I started kind of it requires a ton of marketing to kind of build up hype for a product, and then you realize a lot of the people that make it, let's say in supplements, it's more about the marketing than it is about the product. It doesn't matter how
Right.
good the formula is. If you had the audience, if you have like the previous audience of really good marketing, you succeed.
Right.
And then after a while, I was like, all right, let me try from the other side. What if I start audience first and
Right.
then build from there? And one of the things I tried when I moved to Austin, I used to live in Minneapolis for a bit. I kind of I joined a YouTube channel here. So
Oh,
that's when I
awesome.
kind of quit my corporate job in engineering to join a YouTube channel and like operations side of things. So that means kind of finding sponsors. I mean hiring people. That means trying to like optimize processes for video on YouTube. That lasted about a year. It was fun. It stinked. But it kind of showed me also what it takes to be in this creator world. And throughout that
Right.
time, uh, Sam Parr used to live here in Austin, kind of creator of The Hustle.
Right.
And hearing him in a few conferences, a few events, kind of like first what a great business the newsletter was. Kind of when they sold to HubSpot, like learning all the world of newsletters and building an audience that way. While at YouTube, I realized, oh, working a YouTube channel, how hard video is. And people don't realize how much work goes into a lot of the creators in video that you see. But then I was like, all right, newsletter seems like written, it's easier. Let me try to like work that way. And then one of the frameworks I had heard is like, all right, how about like grabbing something that works in a country and like bringing it somewhere else? So in my mind, I kind of joined like audience, transmitting like business from one country into another, and things kind of got jumbled up. I was like, hey, I speak Spanish. I kind of know now the newsletter scene in the US. Let me see what I can do with that. And that was how Espresso Matutino got started. So my goal, my original business plan was like, all right, be like the hustle. So it's like start Espresso, wait a few years, get acquired by HubSpot. So very sophisticated. And then the name, to be honest, it's not super original either. There's similarities to Morning Brew there. But the idea is like, how do I adapt the business model that has like worked so well with the hustle, the skim, like Morning Brew in the U.S. and bring it to Mexico in Spanish. So that's kind of the,
Awesome.
yeah, the line.
Yeah, yeah, but I don't. It's easier said than done that it's morning brew, but for Mexico, I believe there's in fact a nuance to it where it's news through a Mexican lens too. I believe there is a different flavor that Mexican professionals were looking for, because I believe there were already very tenured traditional media
Hmm.
newsletters already operating like Bloomberg Linea, there's Expansion, and I believe there were enough newsletters doing a morning brewish job. But I believe Mexican professionals were looking for a lot more than the traditional media. So, would you mind telling me about what's the gap that you saw in this tech scene that you decided, okay, this is probably ripe for the picking, and let's start building on this?
Yeah, yeah, I'm definitely not the first person that's tried to build this in Mexico. Kind of like the Morning Brewish of Mexico. There's been prior to. I'd say we've become the most successful at this specific model at this point. We just hit 145,000 subs, and with the podcast, we can get into that later. Because it's a dual game of like uh, lasting long enough to make the business work, having great content, and then being able to monetize it, which I think uh, we've been able to do that. But going back to your question, like the tropicalization, as they call it here, when it's bringing like a U.S. concept and bringing it to Mexico, when
Right.
seeing some of the more traditional media companies, let's say Bloomberg Media in Linea in Mexico or Expansión, I think a lot of their model is still super like traffic based, which it brings back to like the same reason why don't you see more like U.S. businesses, like why didn't they start newsletters 6 years ago? Why
Right.
didn't they see Morning Brew and like do this? So I think their newsletter products are not super sophisticated. A lot of times like throwing a bunch of links, it's like here are our stories for the day, right? Uh,
Yeah.
so now you see in the US a lot of these like Wall Street Journal or like New York Times having these like very large, like well put together newsletters, but it's like what 6, 8 years after a lot of like the morning brews popularized this, right? So on our end, what we've been able to do is again bring this fun tone and wittiness to the news into our newsletter, which is kind of the staple and kind of what built the morning brews and the hustles. So in the Mexican tone, with the Mexican tone of like point of view, the jokes, the kind of the language, and then also one of the things we've done is we steered away a lot from politics. Uh, it's a very like politics heavy here in Mexico, and people have very strong opinions one way or the other. So we
Right.
stuck very clearly to like business and tech, uh, where like that's our lane. We're gonna be very neutral about this, just in the kind of the phone tone. So a lot of what you see these days is like people try to consume news and like video and whatnot, but we're like, hey, we're gonna be fun about how we do it here. It's very short snippets based on like what you see in a Bloomberg or Expansión. It's like 2,000 words for an article. Who's like, who's consuming that these day and age?
Right.
Some people are, if they're like very in-depth analysis about something, but most of those articles are not. So yeah, that's kind of the twist we've taken, and we've made sure to like talk a ton with our audience. Like a lot of polls have calls with them directly. So it's not just like a copy paste of the US model. It's like really how do we adapt this to the needs of the people and professionals in Mexico?
Awesome. Awesome. And talking about the Mexico frame of reference, I do know that WhatsApp is a dominant channel in
Hmm.
Mexico, and that's probably the same in India as well. It's one of the largest markets, but
Yeah.
in Mexico, people use WhatsApp as the cultural app too, not just as a messaging medium. So, any specific reason why you still decided to pursue email specifically for Espresso compared to WhatsApp, which would have probably given you a wider entry point at this point?
Yeah. When I started with Beehive right away. I was kind of seeing they figured out the whole like how to package the software to launch a newsletter. So at the end of the day, I think it's a very effective way to distribute information. And I didn't have to think a lot about the product itself. It's like let me throw the content here.
Okay.
You're definitely absolutely right. Where I think penetration on WhatsApp is probably 90, 95%, if not higher in
Right.
Mexico.
Right.
So one of the things I've noticed, U.S. versus Mexico, is definitely email is not as like key to everything in how professionals operate. So that's I had some hypotheses early on. Again, I live in Texas right now. I don't live in Mexico. Um, and turns out like you see, let's say, higher open rates in the U.S. than you might see in Mexico because the medium kind of is used a little differently. So looking back, I still think email has been a great option to start with. But that being said, about 4 months ago, we launched a WhatsApp version
Oh, you
uh,
did. Awesome.
of the newsletter. So we're not like publicizing it a lot. We have about 10,000 people in there now.
Nice.
And we are using a software that some people, some friends we know in Spain that have a local newsletter through WhatsApp. So we're using WhatsApp communities versus channels. You're in the WhatsApp
Perspective.
ecosystem, so you know the
Yeah.
community hits your inbox versus the channel, which is a completely different tab.
Right.
So and then yeah, we see open rates of what 85% in
I can
WhatsApp
imagine.
versus email, and it's the full newsletter. It's not like here's a link to the newsletter. It's like the full content
Right.
adapted to the WhatsApp model. So it's still a work in progress. This whole WhatsApp thing. It's one of the bets we're taking. The key thing to see is like does it monetize the same way as like email does? Are the same types of sponsors work across? So we've had the same question that you had here, like why not WhatsApp? So we're giving it a go, but I don't have definitive data right now.
Hey, keep me posted because I'm extremely curious about this, especially having spoken about it in the last few months in India specifically. So would love to know what you land up with that. Yeah, but but
Yeah.
but great to know why you went email versus WhatsApp. Now, tell me one thing, Fernando. Is there you talked about again the channels working differently from US versus Mexico. Any of these traditional growth tactics that you would have deployed in US or in Mexico for that matter, which would have fallen flat in the US, which you believe it works specifically in this frame?
I think right now that's been one of the advantages I think I've had where I actually worked for Matt McGarry for a few months in his
Right.
agency, kind of growth agency. So I kind of learned a lot of the best practice in the US. Turns out they also work in Mexico, and the advantage is like no one's doing it there. So a lot of the ads that people get saturated with in the US, uh, we were kind of a lot of the first people using it. So in terms of like meta specifically, right? So I ran a very similar growth playbook that most newsletters would do in the US. The one thing I tried, which I won't try again, is a whole MacBook giveaway. Uh, People really like to game those things, so I won't be doing that again. But in terms of like the rest of the like paid ads, that playbook works.
Awesome. And actually, that's a good point that I think we talked about briefly when we met this year and last year. Is I know that the CPCs are lower than it would be in the US and
Hmm.
Mexico, but tell me more about the long-term play, the unit economics of how you recover the costs of acquiring these subscribers. What does the lifetime value and the unit economics play out like?
Yeah. We're looking at the numbers, and I've mapped out some of the numbers. There's a podcast from Tim from 1440 and kind of walks through his funnel of like what it costs, how do they make, what's the time to break even. And I was like, all right, how do I map this to Espresso? And the numbers, of course, like are all smaller in terms of like volume wise, so
Right.
it is cheaper, and I make less per subscriber. But I end up breaking even at like 3 to 4 months still for new subs. And My CPCs have been going up, to be honest, in terms of like Meta was super cheap when I started. It's been 3 years now. It's getting a little more expensive, but my cost went from what it was maybe like 20 to 30 cents an email to now it's like maybe like 70 to 80, 90 cents, right? Still lower than most
Still lower. Yeah.
US ones.
Yeah.
Uh, the thing is, when it comes to the CPMs that I charge, it's still kind of high-end professionals. I know, let's say, a morning brew, from what I've talked to some of their team at this end, are charging maybe like in the 40s for an email, total like combined CPM. I'm probably like 25, let's say, dollar CPM when I combine
That's
like
pretty
both ad
competitive, I
slots.
would say. Yeah.
Uh, so it proportionally, I think my cost per subscriber is lower relative to how much I charge CPM wise.
Okay.
Uh, I'm not gonna be a $70 million business like a Morning Brew is, but I think I can definitely be competitive within kind of my unit economics in Mexico.
Right. Please don't sell yourself short. Your growth numbers are crazy, so they are impressive in its own right. So I wouldn't go around comparing it with others too. So you're doing absolutely great. Yeah.
Different limitations of the economy as well, so it is what it is. But like it's the
Good
business
problems
model
to have,
itself
I
is
say.
interesting. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I see that you have you've probably spent the last 3 years building the newsletter, and I would say, would you say that the growth has been linear as you started? How did you grow the first 5,000 subscribers? I believe you didn't start out all the way with paid ads. You must have started organically, or am I wrong there?
Honestly, I started straight off with paid ads.
Oh, amazing.
So one of
Okay.
the things I wanted to do from the get-go to see if it even made sense is like let me run some paid ads, try some content. Does anyone even read this? So sure, I started with like family members and 100 people reading the newsletter,
Right.
but as anyone who's done a newsletter, it's super demoralizing day in day out if you're doing it and like you're no one's reading this. And for better or worse, I chose to do it daily from day one.
Right.
Uh, so I was like, I better have people reading this thing and see how do I iterate faster on the product. And yeah, I started, to be honest, straight up paid ads and then kind of iterate the product fairly quickly too. Like if people hate the design, if you have more people, someone will tell you they don't like the design, right? So I know a lot of people are like start organic, and once you have organic, you'll know if it's a hit or not. We went a different route.
Awesome, awesome. And has it been, linear? Has it gone off to the races at year one? I believe 3 years and 140,000 subscribers. I'm guessing there have been different levels that you have been hitting as you went along. So, would you mind describing how the growth has been since you started, Fernando?
I'd say it's been linear. Uh, there's periods of like faster growth, and maybe like we see it sometimes at the start of the year versus middle of the year, and sometimes CPMs rise, and like we get less subscribers. Uh, but it has been fairly linear. Like I don't think there's been high boosts or like we didn't grow as much maybe last half of last year. Are kind of around the 40s, and then this year we're kind of investing more into growth. Um, so yeah, the biggest play here has been it's been 3 years. That's kind of like time itself works its magic.
I know, I know, right. But I believe that you're not stopping at just newsletters. You just started expanding into podcasts and video based content too. By the way, hiring Steve Saldana was a masterstroke. He's so charismatic on camera. I believe he has been at traditional media and video for the longest time. What what did you tell him to convince him to make the move to a newer media outlet like newsletters would?
Yeah, hiring Steve has probably been my best decision ever in the business. And to be honest, I got really lucky.
Right?
Steve was actually hired as a writer, and then
Is it
I was kind of
okay?
director of content. So he's actually his main job is writing the newsletter. Uh, Most content now all falls under him and kind of his direction. Uh, but when I first started, it was a slow process where like I was looking for help to have someone help me curate the news. Uh, So he started kind of part-time basis there, and then over time, kind of I was like selling him on the vision of espresso. It was like he'd been at a fairly large tech like blog website in Mexico called Shataka. Um, and then yeah, kind of sold him on the vision over a few months of working together, and then it was pretty risky for him because we were, how many subs were we at? I don't know, maybe between 50 and 80 at the time. Uh, so yeah, for me it was scary. Kind of, I was like, it's not just me. I gotta sell sponsors to pay someone's salary. But over time, I mean, I knew he had the podcast experience and kind of the video experience, and now we're in talks to see like how does he get out of writing and more into video? Because as you've mentioned, he's really good at it. It comes
Right.
really naturally to him, and the
Yes.
podcast uh, was also one of these moonshots where you're kind of trying, does this make sense? Is it gonna cannibalize our newsletter?
Right.
Uh, but so far it's just going really well, so we're really happy there.
Right. And what makes you and Steve decide, which news topics probably hit the YouTube channel versus the newsletter or both maybe? Is there any a specific rationale that you folks decide, okay, maybe you should get this to video instead of just putting it in a snippet in the newsletter?
Yeah. So as of now, let's say everything that makes it to the newsletter makes it to the podcast. Uh, so it's essentially a one-to-one, and
Oh,
then
awesome.
from there, the podcast lives in, I mean, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and then
Right.
from there, we've also ramped up like reels that are slightly different than the podcast, same news. So we're still optimizing kind of what reels or what news make it into a reel, and the whole point of reels is to feed people to the podcast in general. So actually, we in just 4 or 5 months, we've made it into like seventh place in all of Mexico in business podcast, uh,
Wow.
and top like 70 all podcasts in Mexico, which is pretty nuts in just 5 months.
Right.
And the one thing we have going is we know like time is our on our side, and we're going fairly fast. So our goal is kind of be, are we the top three podcasts kind of in by the end of the year in all of Mexico in business?
Right. And that's a lot of work, I would say, to be honest, because I believe you're a team of what, 4 or 5 people at this point,
Five,
including
yeah,
Steve. Yeah, I'm just basing it off the crew that I see in the newsletter footer,
yeah.
and yeah, and that's you and Steve and probably 3 4 other people, but is this not a lot to be able to go for a newsletter, a podcast, a YouTube channel? I believe you have also fleetingly talked about using AI for your operations. Would you mind talking about how do you keep the team small and use AI to probably make more out of less, I would say?
Yeah, and then we're using AI at different places. Like I started working with Claude Code maybe like 2, 3 weeks ago, and I'm essentially addicted to all the workflows that I
Are we
can.
not all? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it seems to be the
Yeah.
trend. So I'm
Yeah.
definitely falling in that category. So there's
Yeah.
some places that are very like AI driven, and some that are like AI we don't touch. Let's say like a lot of the editorial side and kind of the the taste of the newsletter itself in the words and how do we make the jokes. It's still very human. Uh, the curation of the news, you need to have the context of like what's going on in Mexico, what's relevant, what's not. That's still very human, but it does
Right.
help us. Let's say with like making first drafts uh, and kind of working through, let's say, automating the checks once the newsletter is written. Like, what are the fact checking? Do we have everything in place? Um, we're starting to implement a lot more into the sponsor kind of process where like the briefs for the sponsor, writing the ads for the sponsor, the reporting. So we do use it wherever possible, and I think maybe because studying engineering, I just like love inserting AI everywhere in the process where it makes sense. And there, I mean, there's still a lot of opportunities, but yeah, we've been able to do a lot with a fairly small team.
Awesome, awesome. And this is probably going to be a controversial take, but I do know that you helped bring in what is known as the morning brew or the hustle uh, point of view, but to the native market at this point. Do you, there are also bigger players in the Mexico tech market. Do you foresee a bigger tech market probably trying to implement what you're doing because there are copycats all around? Uh, Can you tell about one specific thing that still makes you unique, which somebody else wouldn't be able to take away?
Yeah, honestly, I don't see any of the traditional media going into our space. And there's been pros and cons to being like the newsletter. I have to say, there's one other newsletter that kind of came maybe 5 years ago in Mexico. It's like a paid business newsletter that are doing very well and they're kind of very polished brand. So that's
Right.
probably the sometimes the most well known because they've been around for a little longer. Uh, but part of the issue of being kind of the one newsletter product is that you have to educate the market to like what is it this? Why would I sponsor you and not just a random newspaper or like the bigger newspapers, right? So
Right.
I think that's been I'm more worried about that, like educating the market than I am about like one of the bigger players trying to like do a newsletter. We've seen small newsletters kind of launch the exact same thing. But again, I've been grinding for 3 years. It takes a long time to build up the audience. So when I see these, I try to look like, are they doing anything different? And maybe it's worth like trying to see and implement features into our own. But like, I'm not really worried of the new players at this point.
That's a good answer. Yeah. Glad that you defended that. But one thing I also very specifically saw in your media kit, I know they're probably the biggest names that I would probably foresee for a global newsletter, not just based in Mexico. I believe it tells something about the ambition of the Mexican job force too, or people seeking employment in Mexico, that there's a lot of ambition, there's a lot of aspirations to be able to understand global tech scene, the global business scene too. What's one thing that you probably could share about the Mexican job market or the Mexican professional tech scene that people don't really understand, which will probably blow their minds?
Yeah. One of the things I've noticed over time is that uh, within Latin America, if we take out Brazil, like Mexico is the largest economy there. Uh, So a ton of any startup that might start in Colombia and Chile or any other countries, their goal is to go to Mexico, and Mexico is kind of like if they make it there, then they can consider maybe let's say going to the U.S. Right? So what we see is a ton of these companies go there, and then our sponsors. I mean, we have like the HubSpot, the Salesforce, the Oracles. Like a lot of them are sponsors in the newsletter. So a lot of professionals in Mexico are in the tech scene. So I think it is within kind of the Spanish speaking world. I think it's like the best place to be at. In a lot of startups, that's kind of like, right, what we're seeing is like Mexico is kind of the playing ground to really start growing in Latin America. So I think that's one of the advantages we have going for us. I don't speak Portuguese, so I can't go to Brazil, which is a bigger market, but within Mexico, I think there's a ton of opportunity.
But tell me this, Fernando. I know we're coming up at time, but this is something that I cannot let you go without answering. But tell me that you're not just sticking to Mexico, you're planning to expand into LatAm. I believe there's a large enough market to crack open when it comes to Latin America too. But tell me you haven't thought about this and you have better, bigger, more expansive plans for Espresso too. So could you share something about what the future holds for your team?
Yeah, to be honest, early on, uh, I assumed I was like, all right, I build in Mexico, copy paste across. There's a lot more difficulties that I've realized over time when it comes to like what does it mean to have kind of audience across all these countries, in terms of even like the payments, in terms of like what like currency they use, what companies want to sponsor multiple countries versus just one country. So at the time, what I started originally is like, oh, I'll just do it all LATAM. Now I'm like, all right, let me figure out the proper Mexico business model and then go from there. So I'm more geared towards how do I go deeper into the professional community with Mexico, whether it's more go towards like an industry dive model
Right.
and kind of build in verticals, or see where I go. So I think there's plenty of opportunity within Mexico. So maybe 3 years ago I would have told you we're going for a LatAm, but I think at this point Mexico there's plenty to do, and then once we figure out that model, we can see if it makes sense operationally to jump around.
Yeah, amazing. And I wish you and your team all the best. But before I let you go, one thing that I would like to know, Fernando, is if you were to start Espresso today, and there's a new state operator waiting in the wings, listening to this particular episode on wanting to start it in their own geography, wherever they are in the world, are there any tips for them to start or anything they should be mindful of? Any mistakes that you did 3 years ago that you'd probably have them not repeat it again?
Let's see. In terms of things that I think we did well that I'd recommend, uh,
That works too.
is and then I can switch it the other round where we messed up, but it's really kind of talking to the audience as soon as possible to guide the product. So especially jumping on calls is super useful, uh,
Awesome.
and going from there. And I think one of the things, I don't know how applicable this is, that I think I should have gone double down on. At times there's been like opportunities where Beehive was like matching dollar per dollar, like your spend or your boost, Beehive boost there. So I
Right.
think at times when I've seen growth was paying off, I was too afraid to like uh, go all out. Uh, and so there's opportunities that come and go where you know your unit economics and you know like if you spend more here, you can make more here, but it's scary. So I've screwed that up a few times that have hurt our growth essentially.
Awesome, awesome. With with that, I think I want to make sure that people have everything they need to be able to understand how Espresso Matutino operates. But please don't stop here. I want you to go and subscribe to Espresso Matutino. I'm going to link it out in the comments, and I'm also going to link out to Fernando's LinkedIn bio if possible. So feel free to read more about what Fernando does and what his